Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's not, unless you're a lawyer or, you know, then it's not something that we're necessarily that familiar with, how to do these sorts of things. So when it actually, is part of people's life, then they find it really easy and it flows and there's no problem. But helping people by going through the process a number of times, really helps. When it comes to legislation, doing court cases, so that eventually people can just do it in their own life every day if they need to do it. If there's something that God shows them, hey, I'm going to find the legal right. Then once you're more familiar with doing court cases individually, then when you come to do the corporate cases, whether that be for the ecclesia or for the area or city or nation, whatever, then it's so ingrained that you just do the same thing. I'm hearing on behalf of my nation. I'm standing here on behalf of the church or whatever, so that then that becomes a very familiar pattern, and people find, just like everything else, you do it a few times and it becomes familiar and much easier. A lot of people have this, oh, this is uncomfortable, or this is different, or I can't do this, and they feel initially, well, this is complicated, how am I going to remember all that? And actually it's quite a simple process when you think about it. It's just making sure that you hear the accusations and you respond correctly, and then use the verdict and do whatever God shows you to do. So it's excellent that you are teaching people and encouraging people to participate. And people who are guinea pigs, they're going to benefit from it and hopefully learn then to do that in their own life and outwork that practically themselves, which was excellent. So great, really good. Yeah.
Mike, I have the question. The first question
Yeah.
I had was, when you're in frequency with God, you're going to be in alignment with His plans and purposes. If you're in full frequency with God, so I'm thinking that but it's not. If there's just if I could turn up the power of God flowing out of me, it wouldn't necessarily get what needed to be done. For example, and here's where I'm coming from. Jesus only did what He saw the Father show Him or tell Him. So that would mean that it had to be on Jesus' scroll. So in other words, He might not have healed that person over there, or a person with healing. If there was amazing healing coming out of God, that one person might not be healed if it wasn't God's plan and purposes, which would be on His scroll. Would that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So really, it would seem to me that really what I want, what you want flowing out from you, is the power of God, or the Holy Spirit and God's glory, to penetrate into and activate other scrolls to form that mystic union in Christ, where we form a shadow, where our scrolls were to interface together to perform His plans and purposes on the earth.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So in a sense, every time you go and you get a mandate for the day, then you're having your destiny scroll revealed for that day, which is seeing what the Father's doing through you that day. Because Jesus said, it's the Father in me that does His works through me. So there's the relationship, there's the surrender to that, there's the outworking, there's the gateways being clear so that that can flow through you. There's all that side of it. And then there's the heavenly aspect to that. What I see there, I begin to decree, declare, call forth so that it can flow through me. And as we then come together corporately with others in the same relationship, with the same blueprint, overall blueprint, let's say an ecclesia blueprint, then we would expect that union, that unity of heart, mind, and purpose that it describes in Acts that they had in the early church, would effectively release those things corporately. And sometimes you go and deliberately choose to corporately engage and do things. And if there are things in the way, and God shows you, then you do the court cases to remove the obstacles that's stopping you doing things what God's calling you to do. I certainly, in my own life, I never I never ask God to remove any of the obstacles that are in my way, because I know that those obstacles give me opportunities of essentially growing, maturing, and overcoming them and learning how to rule. So I see some of the obstacles as part of my scroll to overcome, because the mandate that God gave Adam and Eve was to be fruitful. So he blessed them, of course, so they had the empowerment. He told them to be fruitful, so I have a mandate to be fruitful, to multiply, so I have a mandate to increase, to fill, so I have a mandate to extend, and to subdue, I have a mandate to overcome, and to rule, I have a mandate to bring dominion, government. So that outworks every day, and therefore I need to expect that there will be some things I need on my scroll that will be overcoming, subduing. I'm more than a conqueror, so I've got scriptures that back that up, that enable me to see that as part of my destiny. It isn't, hey, everything's going to be wonderful, no problems. It's going to be, no, I have all the resources to overcome every problem that's coming up. And actually, if the enemy was there, I mean, what would have Adam and Eve had to have subdued? Well, they would have had to subdue the rest of the planet, because the garden would have then grown and expanded, and what they did in the garden would have filled the rest of the earth. But we know the enemy was active. We know that the enemy was cast down into this realm. So we know some of the subduing would have been overcoming the temptation that the enemy brought to them to tempt them to take the wrong path. If they had not taken that path, they would have subdued and overcome him. But they didn't, in that instance, overcome. So we now have to learn how to overcome. So absolutely, both individually, corporately, and in a sense, seeing the universal church, both in heaven and earth, be together in unity, in purpose, is all part of that. Because there's a sense where there is only one church, and many expressions of that, with particular emphasis on purposes on the earth, but they all come from a heavenly perspective, which is why the cloud of witnesses are also part of what we do, because they are part of the universal church, in a sense, and they have their heavenly part and sometimes earthly part to play as well as we do. And it's finding, what are the things I need to do in heaven so that the things I need to do on the earth can be established, and seeing them both all work together in a, as you call it, a mystical union between us and God and us and each other, all in Him and He's in us. So yeah, that's a good description and a way of thinking about it. So yeah.
I got a question, Mike. Did you find in your when you first started to legislate, especially in personal lives, did you find it took a couple of times for people to see results, like to see tangible results after you've done it, done a court case for them or with them? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I've got lots of testimonies of pretty much instantaneous results in some cases, but on other occasions there is the perseverance and the persistence that's needed, particularly when it comes to generational familiar spirits. When there are generational familiar spirits involved, there's a long history of family involvement and personal involvement, and they really don't like to give up that position within a family line. So they will try and break the order or show contempt of court, try and trick us, fool us into re-engaging with them. Sometimes things that we do personally that have got no generational line behind it, are not that difficult to deal with. And particularly if we know our authority as children of God and we know what belongs to us, then the enemy finds it very difficult to deceive us when you know. Just because you do a court case for someone or with somebody, they may not know and have the same level of authority and identity, position, and government that you do. And so you have to encourage them to persevere and to continue to learn to govern that. Because if, let's say, a generational issue that someone's looking to deal with is inadequacy, inferiority, and their whole family line has been the tail and not the head, they operated in poverty, and they've had, you know, everything stolen from them, and all that stuff in their family line, there can be very much an ingrained mindset that's even genetic in its outworking, that when you do the court case to remove the legal rights of the enemy, you may then have to go and do other things that take communion every day, apply that to your DNA, make sure that the mindsets and old patterns of thinking are taken captive and applied to the verdict, the truth that you've got. Now, some people find that much easier, and let's say you were dealing with inferiority or inadequacy. The enemy trick would be, you can't do this because you're inferior and inadequate. And so you have to take it captive and make sure that you don't come into any future agreement, even momentarily, with the enemy, so that you don't fall into that trap. Because once you form agreement, the enemy will look to come into that agreement and establish it. So maintaining correct speech, make sure you don't speak negatively, making sure any negative thinking is captured. Well, that may take a little bit of time. It isn't a magic wand in which the person is necessarily totally, instantly, completely free from every mindset that they might have had or every habit of behavior they might have had. What they do have now is the legal right and the verdict that says, yes, I can be free. The enemy has no rights in my life, but if I don't enforce them and I don't have that confidence to use the identity and the authority that I have, then the enemy will continue to operate, and I have to, you know, overcome that. Because renewing the mind doesn't happen in an instant. The verdict happens in an instant, and the authority to renew the mind is then yours. But you have to renew your mind. And sometimes people have many complicated thought patterns and processes. And I know Ian Clayton, when he talked about the court cases he did with his familiar spirits, it was a pretty much ongoing process. You know, he had to really, he caught himself going down the same patterns and then stopped himself until eventually he grew and changed the way he thought, and his instinctive behavior patterns changed as a result of that. But it wasn't necessarily instant. And I think if people are looking for a instant fix by doing a court case, then again that removes personal responsibility to live. And it's the same in deliverance. You know, people were always looking for someone else to deliver, cast their demons out of them so they wouldn't have the problem anymore. Well, once the demon's removed, you then have to choose to walk in the freedom that you've received. And if you go back into the old patterns, then there's a danger that you invite things back. So it is, I can say, looking back on many of the things that I've dealt with, now they're not a problem. But I had to use my authority initially to ensure that I outworked that and took authority and overcame. And there were certain things that didn't actually fully go until I dealt with them genetically, because they were genetically epigenetic triggers within my DNA that reacted to certain situations and triggered behaviors which almost like were irrational until I identified where that was in my DNA and applied it. And so I would say that definitely a perseverance needed, and seeing it, not going into it negatively thinking, oh, this is going to take years and years, but go into it realistically saying, look, this has been my part of my life for a long time, therefore I'm going to have to learn to behave differently. Which is why, you know, in the Engaging God manual, in the dealing with gateways, I included a battle plan, a 40-day battle plan. And I found that if you can stand in victory renew your mind and change that for 40 days, which is the sort of the period of testing you get biblically, basically 6 weeks, then you develop a new lifestyle. But for some issues, you may need to establish that 40-day overcoming for the enemy then to be eradicated. Unfortunately, what I found is a lot of people aren't willing to engage the 40 days. It's almost like 40 days, how can I battle for 40 days? Well, you don't have to battle for 40 days. You stand on your verdict for 40 days, and you put practical things in place to make sure that you renew your mind and change your speech and practically engage the truth so that you can build up that identity and that revelation. And, you know, there are people here who have begun to do those things and have changed as a result of it and are now free. Because now they know the truth rather than trying to believe the truth. And there's a big difference between knowing the truth and trying to believe the truth. So I would encourage everybody, and when I encourage people to see, look, this may be a battle, you have the victory, and as long as you stand in that victory, you will become free, but there's maybe a process to go through to see that victory, something which is completely won. You know, sometimes the enemy doesn't give up first time. You know, do a contempt of court. If the enemy comes back with a thought, take him back to court. Bring him before the judge and plead a contempt of court. And, you know, I found that was quite effective because, you know, God began to, you know, as a judge, doesn't like when his verdicts get ignored, you know. But a realistic approach is to see that there as an enforcement that needs to take place and a maturity that needs to take place so that we come into line with the freedom that belongs to us, you know. And I think, you know, let's make sure we don't sell the court system as another magic wand system, but something that gives us the authority which we then have to enforce. You know, now I've seen pretty instant results where there have been blockages, where things have been operating that have been removed, and I've, you know, there's quite a number of testimonies of things that have been removed, which are more about the enemy having the authority to do something in our lives, that once you remove it, that authority is no longer there. But when we're looking to deal with personal issues of character, behavior, sin, transgression, iniquity, those type of things, then often that's where we have to be renewed and be restored, and that sometimes that is a process. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mike. That's good.
Okay.
Mike,
Yeah.
the minute a person becomes connected with Christ or born again, our spirit was always in heaven operating, but we just weren't consciously aware of that. And now we're learning to be consciously aware and step in and to operate as sons of God consciously. When Adam was on earth, he didn't have the same issue because heaven overlapped earth,
Yeah.
as I see it. So just following that a little bit further, would that mean that as individuals become consciously aware and take their places as sons of God, what has always been there for us, individuals are the ones that are actually now becoming the overlap of heaven on earth to form cities of refuge?
Yes, absolutely right. As we actually learn to mature into our sonship, then we are gateways of heaven on earth, and when we're flowing and heaven and the river of life is flowing through us, we will begin to create the atmospheres and control those atmospheres and to administrate those atmospheres, so we'll see heaven on the earth. Now, when you look at it from a point of changing culture or changing an area, we have the atmosphere of the earth and we have that influencing, but when you are a gateway, you rule out the atmosphere of the earth, because you're not looking to administrate an everlasting door, which does have to come through the atmosphere of the earth, you are administrating the gateway of your life. So you can create an atmosphere, and a group of you can create an atmosphere which in your sphere has a particular kingdom perspective, and therefore behavior in that atmosphere, and you can do that. If you're then going to look to take that into extend it, then you then need to look at the everlasting doors and dealing with the atmosphere. So I can create my own atmosphere. Together in agreement around a blueprint, we can create an atmosphere. But if we're going to take a dominion role within our, let's say you're going to do that within Toronto, then there are more people in Toronto which are influenced by the power of that atmosphere than live in your circle. And once we have established a city of refuge, we have everlasting doors open in that area of refuge. And as people come into that, they come in under an open heaven and experience the freedom, the healing, the health, and everything else. If they stay outside of it, then they're not engaging it. So as we expand that, we will open more everlasting doors, and we will clear more of the atmosphere, and we will have not only rivers flowing from us, around us and through us, we will also have heaven open and the river flowing out of heaven into that sphere. But we want that sphere obviously to increase, and that will increase as people surrender to the Lordship of Jesus and come into and join with us in that blueprint. And also as we look to deal with the atmosphere in the city, engage the everlasting doors, and begin to open them and see an increase there poured out. But that obviously depends very clearly on what level of mandate each city of refuge has, whether it is a physical whole city which may need to work in cooperation with a number of ecclesia, or whether it's a place within a city that will grow and expand. If others won't join, then you just have to keep expanding until you fill the city. But God's desire generally is that there will be a unity of others who join together, streams becoming one, that effectively administrate the city and that city of refuge, and have everlasting doors which they can open over each area. And you know, the picture God showed me was that there will be pillars of fire. Those pillars of fire would be from heaven touching the atmosphere, you know, and where they touch the atmosphere, it will purify the atmosphere. But when cities of refuge or pillars of fire joined, it would form a canopy of fire which would then begin to clear the whole atmosphere over an area or a city. But you know, that is a little bit of a way off at the moment. You know, even in our area here, we're the only ecclesia operating this way. I'm looking to reach out to others, and I'm working with some others, but there are others who don't want to do this, and therefore where God would rather have, you know, for us 7 streams coming together, and we've seen visions of 7 rivers flowing, 7 waterfalls poured out of heaven with different colors, and those colors coming together to form white light, and a canopy of white light over our region prophetically, over our area specifically. Then if those others don't want to flow together to form white light, but they want to maintain their own distinct colors and do their own thing, then they won't actually flow together, and that's their choice. God desires that. At this point, they are not desiring that, and so they are not flowing. So we will begin to administrate that over our area as God has called us to do. Our desire is for others to join us and be part of what God's doing, so we all join together in God's overall blueprint. But at this point in time, there is resistance, and not everyone's doing that. You know, just because God prophesies it doesn't mean it's guaranteed unless we come into agreement with that word. So, yeah.
So Mike, with something like the Welsh revival or what happened in Toronto or healing move in the U.S. back in the early 50s.
Mm.
Even though there might not have been an ecclesia operator, maybe there was, would that mean there was an everlasting door? They somehow their everlasting doors opened up that those moves happened, or
Yeah. What God showed me with this when I was asking him, you know, how in Revelation it talks about bowls, which are the prayers of the saints. There were certain places that may well have had a pathway, or let's say an intersection of an everlasting doors in the past that may have been open, and people prayed. I mean, most revivals you can trace back to people praying, calling out on God, you know, interceding for their area, and it seems it's like when the bowl gets filled, it gets poured out, and an everlasting door opens, and it pours onto the earth, and we call them revivals and removes of God, awakenings, you know. And obviously recently you'd see some of those would be Toronto and Pensacola and Lakeland in Florida, and you know, a number of Albany, other places that you can read about where that's taking place. Now, generally, that was God's desire in the old order of things to bring about a renewal, a restoration, you know, and call his people into something more. And in most of those occasions, one way or another, man got in the way of it, people fell out, the enemy was able to block off the everlasting door, and either it partially stopped or fully stopped, and then it wasn't there anymore. I believe in where we are now, God wants us to administrate those doors, those gates. So it's not just, oh, well, we're praying, pleading, calling out. No, we've matured to a position of sonship where we are in the realm of heaven, and we are beginning to administrate, opening those doors, clearing the atmosphere, and ensuring that it doesn't stop. So those are the embassies of heaven on earth, which are going to be habitations rather than temporary things. Now, I know God's desire wasn't those things stopped ever, but we didn't learn the lessons of the past, and so we allowed the enemy to block off the flow. And it's really important that we make sure that we don't allow the enemy to block off the flow in what God's doing in this, which means honoring each other, respecting each other, operating in culture of honor with each other, seeing the differences that we all have, but working together. And I think that's a really, really important thing, because the enemy will always try and sow in division, sow in strife and enmity and all those things, competition, and we've got to make sure that we don't operate that way. And so it's an attitude of heart, it's a demonstration of love, and respecting difference. And I know that that is the enemy's tactic, because I'm, you know, subject to some of it, you know, where, you know, there's a lot of criticism that goes on of what we're doing, what I'm doing from some groups, because it doesn't look the same as what they're doing. And unfortunately, they, rather than seeing, hey, we're all different and we've got a different part to play, you know, there's some criticism, you know, because, you know, in what I do, you know, I don't tend to focus on the, hey, let's all just get drunk in the spirit type stuff, but I want to teach people how to do this when they're not drunk in the spirit. Am I against getting drunk in the spirit? Absolutely not. You know, do I encourage people and do I engage personally and have intimacy and ecstatic encounters with God? Absolutely I do. But I don't major on that, and when I go away and teach or do conferences, it's really more about how can I help you learn to do this, rather than, so it becomes a voluntary thing that you can do every day, rather than associating just with ecstatic times when there's amazing worship or amazing things. So those things work together, and I don't see there any need for any sense that they need to be in competition. And I respect and honor those that teach and encourage and inspire experiences with God and wonderful things, because I think that's great. But also, people also need to learn to open their gates and to cleanse themselves and to present themselves a living sacrifice, so that those things can become something which is done on a voluntary basis when they need to do it. So I'm aware of a lot of criticism that's going on, which unfortunately is unnecessary. And I would desire, that we all respect and honor each other in the different things that we're called to do, so that, in what God is doing, we work together, and that enables different people to bring different things to add to the overall mix. Because I can only bring through who I am and through what God's done through me, and I encourage others to do the same. The more people who are engaging and bringing through themselves what God has called them to do, the more we're going to get a bigger, fuller picture of the kingdom and what it's about. God is not going to do anything through one person. He's going to do it through groups of people coming together, benches forming together, government forming together to establish it. And we really have to be careful that this is sensitive times. When you begin something new, the enemy will always try and pollute the foundation, or again cause strife and enmity in this whole new thing. And I really, for those who, are struggling with some of this, I encourage people to forgive, to release, keep their hearts right, bless those that are different, who do things differently, so that we can actually see the multifaceted, multicolored nature of what God does, bring diversity in everything, so that we can do things in a diverse way, which some people will be reached one way and some another. And I am concerned that there's a mixture of people putting a new patch on an old wineskin, particularly when it comes to leadership, rather than, you this for yourselves, in terms of this whole issue of the unanimity and the uniformity issues of, okay, R3-1, or how does it work? And I even recently I've had some testimonies of where people are trying to control, where people are trying to come into an area and control the area rather than get alongside and encourage people, and it's a danger. And we're all in transition, we're all in a process of transformation, but it's very important, if you're in any roles of authority, to really make sure your hearts are right, and that we're not coming from an old governmental perspective of someone coming in and telling what people to do and providing coverings for people, rather than getting alongside and helping people to build their own foundation. So I'm having opportunities to go to places and engage with people, and I've seen some examples and heard testimonies of examples where a very strong old type of government has been in place, even though people are talking about the experiences of what God's doing. The practicality of how they're outworking it seems to be very old, and we've got to be careful of that, because God wants a reflection of heaven. That's the whole point of any form of leadership. Needs to be foundational and people build upon it, not on top of the mountain or on top of everything and ruling downwards. So it is a key, and I think, whenever we see it, we need to pray and intercede and bless, but really look to see change. And I think I really want to see a really new way of doing things, not just a rehash of the old with a few new titles attached to it. So yeah.
The problem you have with what you just last said, even in I think our experience, was that when you talk to people that come together and you talk about how it's in Christ and harmony together in unison, that even people that offer that want to go back and they say, tell me what to do, lead us. And it's almost like going back with Moses with the people, and they say, no, you go and you come back and you tell us. We want to lead. There seems to be a mindset within people in our identification that we need that.
Yeah, because it's been how it's been done. you know, in a sense, all the religious systems that have been set up have not reflected heaven. You know, they've reflected an old covenant system, which goes back to Moses. You know, and that's what they did. They appointed Moses. You go for us. You hear. You come and tell us, when God was inviting them all to come. You know, so that's been the enemy's tactic for a long time. You know, is to set up mediators and substitutes so that we don't engage God for ourselves. And then, you know, you look at the institutional church and a lot of people who would say yes, they're Christians, and you ask them how much of what they believe and their understanding of God and the nature of church and everything else comes from what other people have told them, and how much of it comes from what God has given them directly or affirmed directly. A lot of them are just doing what someone else has said. So it's ingrained in the system, which is why this is a reformation of that system. You know, we cannot just, you know, it has to be a new wineskin. It cannot be patches on the old. And of course, it's easier for people who have been used to someone else doing it for them. It's easier to ask someone else to go and do it, because then you've got no personal responsibility. So, you know, and a lot of people, you know, when they did do things in the past, probably got damaged, hurt, disappointed, let down, you know, abused by leadership in some way, and therefore they're very reticent to take responsibility because of their previous experience, and all that needs to be dealt with. So again, we've had to do court cases here that specifically dealt with the failure to take responsibility, why fear was in place. It's all fear-based. There's so much fear. You know, fear of getting it wrong, fear of being told off, fear of being disciplined, fear of being. So many fears involved, which I think, you know, is really important that we deal with that foundationally with people at the beginning, to set them free, help them become free. Again, continually encourage them. You can hear God for yourself. We want to hear what God is saying. We really want to embrace that, you know, which is why, you know, for us, we have our bench of 3, and then we have our bench of 7. The bench of 3 don't tell the bench of 7 what God has said. We may give some direction as to, can you go and hear God about this, or can you go and seek God about this, but they're responsible for going seeking God and getting the answers, not us. Same with our bench of 12 and all our 7 mountains. The people who are on the 7 mountains and the benches on those mountains are responsible to establish the government of that mountain, the blueprint, the mandate, and everything else, the declarations of that mountain. The bench of 3 just encourage them and support them and ensure that what they bring is in line with the overall blueprint, you know, and not off in some wild tangent that really isn't what God has authorized us to do. So we always want to make sure, are we authorized to do this? Is this part of our mandate? Yeah, absolutely. Therefore, yeah, go for it. You know, so it is all about that, and that's a very built into the fabric of the religious systems, so that it's very difficult for people who've just been used to doing this for years to do it. And I can remember 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, here God challenged us as to church and what church was, and we were looking at the whole issue. What is this? You know, this just doesn't seem to be fulfilling the role. And God told us to stop doing everything other than just gathering once a week. All our groups, all the house groups, everything we were doing, stop them. And what we said to people is, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're just going to ask you to go and do what you feel God's calling you to do. So if you want to meet together, great, but do it because God's telling you to do it, not because we're telling you to do it. Well, you know, one person I remember saying at the time, I'm lost. I don't know what to do. All my Christian life I've been told what to do, and now you're saying I can make decisions. I don't know what to do. I'm feeling totally lost. You know, which is a consequence of the previous experiences that most people have had. You know, now we're encouraging people to take responsibility. We have to help them do that by dealing with any mindsets, blockages, things that may be in the way, that are stopping them believing that and outworking that. Definitely. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a mindset, and people default to it, and we have to continually encourage and make sure that we don't agree with that mindset and then become mediators. You know, I mean, a classic illustration of that is a couple came here a few weeks ago. They felt God. Felt God saying they were to come and move here and work with us here. And immediately they said, "Can you pray with us and prophesy over us and confirm what you feel God's saying?" You know, and I'm like, I could, but I'm not going to. You know, let's step into heaven together and let God tell you what He's saying. And if that then is what God is saying to you, then I'm very happy to come into agreement with you and God. I'm not going to actually tell you, because all that's doing is reinforcing an old model. You know, we had a couple of people who came here actually from Finland, just turned up a couple weeks ago, a couple of young lads, and they wanted me to pray for them, and they wanted me to cast out their demons and do things for them. And because I wouldn't, they were disappointed because I didn't pray for them. I set up our ministry team to pray with them. We looked after them. We tried to help them. But actually, they had a religious mindset that said, well, the person has to do it. You know, and actually, I wasn't going to play that game, because I'm not going to reinforce that only certain people can minister to people when we're all capable of doing it. You know, so we have to be careful that we don't play the game, and we don't, you know, allow people to put us back into those positions, even though we don't want to. So, yeah.
Well, you know what? And the real danger, leadership tradition, is people coming under my scroll if I'm the leader.
Yeah.
And they never come under their scroll, so we can never do as a body what we're supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And all I'm doing is fulfilling. They're coming under my scroll and fulfilling my scroll, helping me fulfill my scroll, never touching their scroll.
Yeah. See, in reality, we don't have a corporate scroll that's one person. It's God's scroll.
Yes.
You know, it's God's blueprint. So, you know, God may give that through one person, but you have to let go ownership of it. I mean, I've had to do that here. It's like, you know, being someone who's sort of been visionary and been responsible for hearing a lot of what God has said and bringing us on this journey. When we became a bench of 3, I had to completely allow that this is God's blueprint. It's not mine. I just saw what God was wanting us to see. Now we can all see that, and we all are responsible for that blueprint, but it's God's, and we're all participating as living stones as part of what God wants to build, because we're called by God to be part of this. It's not owned by one person. You have to let go of ownership, therefore ownership equals control. I want to own, in a sense, that I'm part of this. So it's, yes, I'm part of this and I own that, but actually it doesn't belong to me. You know, and it doesn't belong to anybody. It's God's. You know, God doesn't give someone a blueprint and then say this belongs to you, as opposed to this is my blueprint and you're serving me in it. There's an aspect of we mature so that the level of service and how we do it increases so that we are operating as co-heirs with it, but it's all about God and it's all about Him, not about us. You know, and that again, you know, if it feeds our ego or it feeds our need for acceptance or for affirmation or any of the things that potentially the enemy will use, then we need to make sure we get healed up and restored and made whole in those areas, because, you know, it will draw us back. You know, flattery, all those things will draw us back if we need them. You know, let's get our affirmation from God, our acceptance from God, then we'll be free from the fear of man or seeking man's approval, which will be a trap and a snare to us. You know, so it is really, really important that we deal with those areas. And you know, I have a personal destiny and a personal scroll, which God has written, but it's God who wrote it. God agreed it with me. You know, yes, I accept it and take responsibility for it, but even then it's not independent of my relationship with God. It can only be outworked in my relationship and union with him. And the same with all of us. You know, yes, as we accept that we have a role to play, and that is a living stone as part of something that God's building. You know, I'm not isolated and on my own, but that is not under one person or one person's control of it. You know, and that's why a bench operating together, all equal, is so important in the establishment of this. Otherwise, if there is one person who's heading the bench and one person who's control of it, then it will be that person's, and they will demand obedience to it. You know, which is a danger. Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yep.
I was listening to one. Excuse me. And you spoke about Jesus embracing, in the context of talking about the ketubah, you spoke about Jesus, I believe, embracing an unleavened people, and I got to thinking about that in the context. Okay, so Jesus spoke about leaven in at least two different ways, where, you know, in a positive way and then in a negative way, regarding the Pharisees and regarding the kingdom of heaven, where the leaven gets in and it goes through the whole loaf. So I was thinking about all that, and I'm wondering if it has to do with our DNA and how, you know, okay, so the kingdom of heaven, once you embrace the kingdom of heaven and you're growing as son and you're communing with God and taking communion, is that how the leaven goes through? And I thought about it in the context of Noah and his genealogy, and how Noah was the righteous man found in his generations. So his genes were pure, and so with taking communion, we're purifying our DNA. So I was thinking about all that in the context of leaven, and I wonder if you could shed some light on that for me. Oh, can't hear you, Mike.
Let me turn this off. Yeah, it's definitely a good way of looking at it. In a sense, you know, the illustration with the marriage ceremony and the ketubah was that the Feast of Pentecost was a celebration and a reminder of that event. And so what they did was, you know, they had the leavened bread, which was the only occasion they were called to use leavened bread, oil that was broken, and then they put oil into it, and they waved it, in a sense, before God. And there was a reminder that God was willing to engage with an unleavened people and to bring them into wholeness. And so it was a sense of saying that God, we don't have to be perfect for God to love us or engage with us. And that's one aspect of it. So the whole Pentecost was, you know, will you marry me? And tongues was, yes, we will. So there was a whole difference there between the old and the new covenant, in that in the old covenant they said, no, we won't. And, you know, Moses represented them in that relationship. But definitely, you know, Jesus warned us about the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees, and therefore is looking at, okay, you have negative things and it will spread if you're not careful. So don't allow those negative things in, which are again, government, Herod, king, and the religious side of it, the Pharisees. So don't let, you know, religious spirits control you, and don't let political spirits control you, because if you do, they will influence and affect everything you do. So that's the general picture of it. And of course you have the kingdom as leaven, which means that God's kingdom can spread and fill everything in that way. So looking at our own lives, yes, the more we engage in intimacy with God, the more we take communion, the more we can see that the kingdom, the rule of God is established in our lives, the more we get brought into an alignment with the eternal image, our body, soul, spirit coming together in union, together in unity with him. Yeah, all that is certainly a growing, maturing, restoring, renewing process. It's not an instantaneous process, although Jesus did everything to enable that process to be fulfilled instantaneously on the cross. We have to apply it and mature and grow to come into the sonship that we already are, but we're not mature enough to function in. So certainly our DNA is an aspect where you can see all the impure or being renewed, restored, repaired, whatever, so that none of the wrong seed or none of the wrong epigenetic factors of iniquity are there. Purity, refining, and you could see that as the kingdom, God's rule established in the whole of our body, soul, and spirit. So it's a definite way of looking at it, yeah. And the ketubah, is a key aspect to us being able to outwork and fulfill our destiny in that way. And I do believe God wants us very much to come into a new, fresh, revelatory experience of him. And therefore, the new way of engaging him is really important in it. And I love the fact that that God chooses to take the foolish things of the world and confound the wise, and the have-nots to confound those that have, because what it's saying is we're not doing this in our own strength, we're not doing this in our own natural ability, which comes from the pathway of the knowledge of good and evil, but we're coming from the pathway of the tree of life. So this is a God thing in us, not a natural thing, which would have always happened if they hadn't have messed up, and they would have been conformed to the image of God, as they would have been transformed. They were sinless but not perfected, and God still wants to perfect us in holiness, and that could be seen as the leaven of the kingdom filling us. And people have a problem, you see, with mixed metaphors. And I know certain people will always say leaven is bad, always, because of what their mindset is. Whereas Jesus very clearly used the same illustration to refer to good and bad. So it's what God is saying rather than, a rigid construct of something in this. But yeah, definitely can see it that way. And if that becomes a helpful analogy, because it's a process of it. And what happened in the dough? It got kneaded, and God does the kneading. Same thing as the potter. The clay has to be molded and shaped to produce the pot. And therefore there's quite a bit of moving around and pressure and shifting of this, that, and the other. And if we surrender and allow God to do that, then we'll see the shape of the image that God has created us to be formed. If we resist it, and if we start to say, as the story goes, if the pot says to the potter, well, I want to be this shape, it's, the tail wagging the dog, as we say, rather than the other way around, but yeah.
Thanks, Mike. That's good.
Okay.
One last question. The problem is, though, that unless we deal with our gates, which affect our identifications, we're never going to hear clearly from God, and we're going to always go off on the wrong tangent. God's always communicating to us, but how we're receiving it, and based on our identification for need, we distort it. And then we distort everything around us with it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. And that's why we have to be willing to surrender on a daily basis to the Lordship of Jesus, to Father being on the seat of government in our lives, and then we then submit everything to him, and that then helps us not to go down those wrong pathways, because we don't just instinctively do what we've always done. We ask him before we do anything. And actually then when you mature, you get to the point where you go and ask him to show you what to do and to give you a mandate, and you don't do anything outside of that. So for me, one of the first things that I do is I surrender my free will. I don't want free will to choose to do negative things. I want to do the will of God. Therefore, I don't want free will. My free will is I choose your will. Just as Jesus, not my will, but yours be done. So my whole desire is framed around that, and therefore God has got plenty of opportunity to enable and show me the areas where, no, that isn't the right path, that isn't the right way, and to bring change and transformation. And dealing with our gateways and allowing God to purify us so that we hear more clearly, we know him intimately, so that we know that does not line up with God. Not that we put him in a box, but there are certain things that I know God wouldn't ask me to do because there would be sin. So I know he's never going to ask me to do sin. He's never going to ask me to do anything that contradicts who he is. And the more time we spend with him, the easier it is to discern what will please his heart and what will displease him, what will bring reverence to him and what will bring any disrepute to him. So I use the gateways of fear of the Lord and reverence to be that which filters those things that I do. So I want everything that comes through in terms of direction of my life to go through those gates. And then my conscience will be activated by reverence and fear of the Lord, which will then protect me from making wrong decisions. Because I've submitted those decisions to his lordship by choice. Not because he forces me to, because I want to. I don't want to do my own thing, because I've seen the results of doing my own thing, and they're not very positive. But it does take a process, and this is where I really encourage people to be willing to make that sacrifice of saying, yeah, I'm willing to go through this process of change. And in this process, I know I'll make some mistakes, but I know it's not my heart to. I know sometimes I'll default to a way of thinking, oh, that's not right. I know sometimes I'll make a decision emotionally when I should have made it by choice. But I'm submitting those things so that those things become less and less, and I become more flowing with the life of God, because I know he loves me, and therefore I never feel condemned. Even when I make a mistake, I'm not condemned, because he forgives me and he cleanses me and he gives me an opportunity of learning from my mistake. Well, how do I know that? Because I've spent so much time with him. I know it's his kindness that draws me to repentance. I know that he loves me, and I know that love is the motivation behind everything he does. And even when he disciplines me and disciples me and trains me, it's because he loves me. So I don't fear his discipline or training. I embrace it and I ask him for it. So the more mature we get, the easier it is to recognize what it is. So yeah, you're right. The encouragement to deal with gateways, hearing, clearing up our relationship with God is absolutely key. And that will absolutely involve dealing with the unmet needs in our life, the driving, motivating forces that we've sought to get met by the outside world, and now we have to look to the inside, not the outside. And so you have this totally change of where we're looking for everything. So everything then flows from heaven through our first love gate, through our spirit gateways to engage our soul, and therefore all the wonders of God and the fullness of who he is and the amazingness of who he is, that awesomeness of God's who he is, his provision, his protection, his blessing, everything comes in my relationship with him, not anywhere else. And by doing that, then I'm being proactive in seeking him to purify and refine me, so that I can hear him more clearly, that I will recognize his voice, and actually when he does say something which seems to be out of the box or beyond my frame of reference, my spirit gives me peace about it, because my spirit is trained by fear of the Lord and reverence, and my conscience will say, yeah, that might be a bit strange or a bit odd, but it in no way contradicts the very nature of God, and therefore, yes, that's God's voice. So I don't mistake God's voice, for my voice, or for the enemy's voice, or any familiar spirit, I recognize it because I've spent a lot of time listening and hearing him and developing that, so that I'm sensitive to when Jesus is speaking to me, or the Father, or the Spirit, and I recognize their voice, because I've listened. Yeah.
In the end, what he's dealing with is my character.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with Christendom, our character.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. And the thing is, not to be offended. There's so many people get upset when God starts to deal with character issues, rather than, yeah, I know there's a whole lot in my life that is still needing sorting out, but I submit and surrender, and I recognize that when God does that, he loves me, because I don't need to pretend or hide or go in the bushes and cover up those character defects. I'm proactively saying, God, expose those things. Show me where my heart isn't right. Show me if there are any things there which don't line up with love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and kindness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. Because I want to reflect his character, which must mean I've got to change. But I only see change as a positive thing. And I'd much rather fall on the rock and actually embrace it, rather than the rock fall on me and have to squeeze me till I get to the point where I'm willing to change. I have no reputation, so it doesn't really matter what anyone else thinks. So if God shows me a character defect, I don't mind other people knowing, because I know it's not about what they think about me. It's about what God thinks about and who he sees me to be and how he feels about me that really counts. And I know he loves me, and that frees me to embrace transformation and character formation. Because there's a not being conformed to the world and being conformed or transformed into the image of Jesus. So I have to be not conformed anymore, which means change. So, yeah, there we go. Anyway.
That's good.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll leave it there.